EU is a circus. It's, if you ever get the chance to vote out, maybe you should do actually, because that's going to create even more chaos. The EU is presently 28 different member states. One of those member states is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, sometimes referred to as the Great Britain, but that's actually the island where Wales, England, and Scotland is. But the United Kingdom, they are presently working on an agreement with the EU to get out. And today, there was actually a new development that they seem to have agreed on something. What, we don't know yet. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I have three different topics: the EU circus, Brexit, short update, and then admission and importation. The EU circus, why is it so difficult? Well, as I said, presently 28 different member states. We have 24 official languages. It's not like everything is made in English and then translated, and then, as is common in some lease agreements, you say if there's a difference between this language version and this one, the English one prevails. That's not how it is in the EU. All of them are official languages. So the Finnish version is just as good as the Italian as the German. As you can imagine, that causes a lot of confusion. Besides that, we have a lot of different cultures in the EU. I mean, look at the English courts, right? They still wear wigs. You have the French, they're still pissed about the Zero Meridian not being through Paris. We have the likes of Berlusconi in Italy, who's more into anything but the best interest of Italy. And then, of course, we have Greece. They're just recovering from the biggest crisis in the history, and it still looks like Acropolis. The EU, in brief, the three most important institutions is the European Parliament, European Commission, and the Court of Justice of the European Union. The main three institutions involved in lawmaking is the Parliament, representing the EU citizens directly elected by them. We have the European Commission, in brief, COM, which represent the interest of the Union as a whole. And then, of course, we have the Court of Justice of the EU upholding the rule of the EU law. It's very, very, very complex. Even though the rules are supposed to be the same all over the EU, why are the same rules interpreted differently? Well, we have to look at the rule-making process in itself. There are two major ways of doing this. Well, actually three, if you count the judgments from the EU Court of Justice. One is a regulation. A regulation is applicable directly. That's like a law. Even a citizen, private citizen, can point at a regulation and say, well, it says in this EU regulation that I can do this. So if the national law in any of the 28 member states differ from that, the EU regulation prevails in the language of the member state. The other way of lawmaking is a directive, like the VAT directive. VAT is value-added tax. That's the dreaded 15 to 27% tax that is on everything sold or imported. The VAT directive is just a framework. It's not directed at the private citizen. It's directed to the member state. So it gives them the framework, and within the, what should we say, the limits of that framework, you have to have your national law. So why is it done this way? Well, that's done because some of these areas of lawmaking are so complex that you cannot have just one unison law for the whole of EU. Like the VAT laws in many member states dates back from the 60s when VAT was first invented. So why is the story never the same? Well, take Denmark and the United Kingdom, for example. Many of you may remember the 8-ton rule, where you could import an aircraft into the EU by way of the UK, and if it weighed more than 8 tons, then it was VAT-free. That rule came back from the 60s when they invented VAT, and they simply said that any airline or any aircraft that is this big is used by an airline, so we shouldn't subject it to VAT, just like what they do with merchant ships. In Denmark, we had another rule that they thought was the same, that said that sporting aircraft are subject to VAT, whereas non-sporting aircraft are not. That was a great time for business at that time. We could import an aircraft, a Cessna Citation, into Denmark, 0% VAT, and move it to France to a private guy. If he had imported it directly into France from the States, he would have to pay 20% VAT. Via Denmark, nothing. That was great. The biggest problem with that was actually convincing people this was legal. You know the old saying, if it's too good to be true, it usually is. If it sounded too good to be true, but it was true. Anyway, why is the story never the same? Well, it comes back to the language issues. If you have an interpretation issue, like in Danish, for example, we have a saying that covers a period from midnight to midnight called a døgn. You don't have that word. And it's the same thing and vice versa with all kinds of different languages. So this causes a lot of confusion. There's thousands and thousands of interpreters and translators working at the EU because you've seen this. It's like the UN. When they talk, there's instant translation going on. This causes a lot of confusion, and that's the circus. Let me give you an example. The EU VAT is, as I mentioned, governed by a VAT directive. There's no doubt about the fact that no member state can allow an importer to reclaim or defer 100% of the VAT if there's any non-business use involved from the beginning. It can come later on, but when you import an aircraft, you have to declare whether this is used for business or privately. This permission to reclaim this value-added tax is, of course, looked at a lot of creative lawyers, and they come up with different structures and different schemes. Sometimes they do this, it can go unnoticed for years, and perhaps no one is caught. But sometimes they are. When the shit hits the fan, we all know about the Paradise Papers, right? That created a lot of attention because that revealed that some member states has actually allowed a system where you could be very creative. You could import an airplane, use it privately, and still reclaim a lot of the VAT. That is changing now. The Commission is very, very aggressive, and they're very keen to act on this. And actually, on November 8th, this press release came out. Based on the findings of the investigative journalist that was behind Paradise Papers, the Commission has now decided to follow up on this illegal tax break for yachts and aircraft. And they're targeting the Isle of Man and the prime, I forgot what his name is, what's it called, the Prime Minister of the Isle of Man, the key something. The chief ministers just said today, yeah, we're cooperating with this, we'll investigate, and we'll have to come to some sort of an agreement. So this is heavily scrutinized by the Commission and the EU institutions right now, because there's a lot of money involved. Another example is when they actually implement legislation, but they do it in a creative way. They're not just using it. And we have examples of that from lessors or lessees who can import, who can reclaim, who cannot. How can an AOC holder be VAT exempt? What is an AOC holder? That's the EASA term for 135 or 121 operator. All of this has been handled very, very creatively by a lot of people, and they're now looking into that. I think I'm running out of time here, so let's move on. You can always come back to these slides and, of course, contact us with any questions. The EU circus. As I said, some development is going on. I don't know if you can read this, but it's some paratroopers out of an EU airplane, and they're all wearing the Union Jack. Do you think they will have a soft or hard landing, that those are saying? Well, they say, well, considering they have yet to agree on a design for the parachute. And that's what they're doing right now. It seems like at least Theresa May and the EU has decided on some kind of an action plan. They're having meetings right now, and there's a schedule, I think there's a press release scheduled for tomorrow. Whether they can agree on this or not, I don't think so. But who am I to say? I had colleagues who were saying to me, you know, what do you know about the Brexit? And I say, well, it takes two to get a divorce, right? So let's just hear it from the, well, you can decide whether I'm the guy or the girl in this marriage. So anyway, a short update. The Brexit date is end of March 2019. That's when they have to leave. There's a transition period until the end of 2020 that has already been agreed upon, pending a final deal. A no deal seems close until today, at least. Prime Minister May has been saying that 95% of the Brexit deal has been agreed upon, and now it seems that they have even more now. The most important points was actually the Northern Ireland border to Ireland. They've been talking about a backstop solution where Northern Ireland could remain a part of the EU, free movement of goods, free movement of people, and also being a part of the customs union, and the rest of the UK then leaving, so they could use this kind of as a hub. The problem is that Ireland is not leaving the EU, so they don't want a hard border with Northern Ireland because that would create an enormous amount of problem for the people living in that area. But on the other hand, you cannot do nothing. That would be like having the island of Catalina off the coast of California being a Mexican territory, but also a part of California. Can you imagine how many people would like to go through there then, in that case? And that would be kind of similar. So lots of issues. It's still not in place, but it's going to be exciting to see what's going to happen tomorrow. If a deal is made between the EU and the Prime Minister, it must be approved by both the EU and the British parliaments. And they're talking about a second referendum and leave it to the people for a democratic process yet again. I don't know if that's happening or not, but your guess is as good as mine, as nobody really dares to make any conclusion. I'm sure Alistair can have some meanings on this, or even add to the confusion maybe. So what happens? Well, if Brexit is cancelled, it's business as usual. It's unlikely. There's a majority for it, in my opinion, between most people. You can have a deal. It's called a soft Brexit, where the UK remains in part of the EU. That's very likely. That's at least going to be the transitional period where they stay within the customs union. There's free movement of goods, free movement of people. And the only result, which would be really, really bad for the Brexiters, is that now they won't have a say at all. They won't even have a seat. It's like Norway. You can be a part of it, but you cannot make any decisions. We don't even want to hear what you have to say. So that's going to be really, really hard for the Brexiters. If no deal is made, we call it a hard Brexit, and that's going to treat the United Kingdom just like any other third country. They won't be able to benefit from any of the trade agreements, free movement of goods or people or taxes or anything else. That's going to be really tough, and that's going to create havoc for sure. It's going to cause uncertainty for many months and years. If they leave on a hard Brexit, there will actually be no flying with UK airlines into Europe and vice versa. What are they going to do? There are even people, you know, what do you call it, when you buy a lot of food and you stock up for, 3 or 4 or 5 months. That's going to be really tough. And then will the EU accept an Isle of Man UK importation prior to Brexit? Probably. This is a BBC drawing that shows a little bit about it. You can consult the slides if you want, and it's also, BBC has a very extensive coverage of the Brexit, of course. It's extremely interesting for them. Pros and cons for Part 91 operators operating into the EU. This presentation we have made now, since I only have 6 minutes and 43 seconds to go, that's not including the questions, right? Is the most simple presentation of EU importation and admission issues ever. Some kind of EU entry procedure is always needed. That's a rule of thumb. Not even a rule of thumb. That is the rule. So just bear that in mind, and you have learned something today. You cannot just do anything and think that's a third option. You either have to import an airplane or you have to admit it. And if you admit it, you're using temporary admission. That's what Delta is doing every day when they fly into Europe. They're temporarily admitting their airplane. These are the only two options. EU importation and VAT are often presented to you guys based on articles and paragraphs when we try to teach you about the law. It's very complicated, and with 5 minutes and 51 seconds to go, there's not a chance in hell that this will work. So instead of doing that, we based the remaining of this presentation on frequently asked questions and listing only the pros and cons. So, how the aircraft is imported or admitted? VAT between 15 and 25% of the value of the aircraft. That underlines the need to do the right thing. This is an enormous amount of money on a big, big jet. Okay. Full importation, you have no problems. You can do this. If you're allowed to fully import, you can file for it, like they did in the Isle of Man for airplanes. You can get the VAT back. You have no problems. If you are admitting it, you have no VAT liability. The VAT is suspended, so that's also a green. Now, what can you not do with the VAT? Well, the lessee cannot import an aircraft. It's only the real owner that can do it. It must be used for correct economic activity for a minimum of 5 years. It's very complicated. It comes with a huge potential risk if you do something wrong. Just look at the Isle of Man right now, the press release I was just referring to. It can go wrong if you're using the aircraft in a different way than you initially thought of. It may have consequences. If you're temporarily admitting the airplane, the only stopping blocks are you cannot issue a ticket. Well, you can charter a full airplane, but you cannot issue an individual ticket. Stupid as it may be, that's the correct interpretation as has been underlined by the EU Commission. And you cannot have commercial freight. Other than that, you're good to go. Non-business use. Say, for example, the CEO is using an aircraft for entertainment, hobby, commuting, or personal recreational travel. Can you do that with a full importation? Yes and no. It's very complicated. If you have declared it, maybe you can use it. If you haven't declared it, no, you cannot. With temporary admission, you have unlimited non-business use. Aircraft can be used for any purpose because it's not really imported. You haven't declared VAT or anything else. What you have done is declared that you want to use this aircraft for private purposes. Let's just move on here. All these, by the way, all these slides are available on our website. You can consult those. There's also a brochure on your table that shows most of these, these plates. Flying internally EU. Can we fly from Paris to Hamburg? If it's fully imported, unlimited use, not a problem. Temporary admission, you can fly anywhere you want, unlimited, but only for 6 months per entry. That means you bring the aircraft in, you can fly around for 6 months, then you leave, and that triggers a new period. So if you don't stay for 6 months, then it starts again. There is no limitation to how many times you can re-enter. So basically, there is no difference unless you want to base your airplane in the EU. Next, pros and cons. Fixed base, long-time parking in the EU. Can you rent a hangar? Full importation? Yes, you can do that. If you want to base the airplane in the EU, your only option is a full import. With temporary admission, no, you cannot rent a hangar. You have to base the aircraft outside of the EU. Fixed base is not allowed. Long-term parking is not a good idea. And long-term parking under all circumstances has to be less than 6 months, of course. Can we take EU resident colleagues from London to Milan? Full import? Yes, you can. Temporary admission? Yes, you can. Not a problem. They can be EU resident, they can be EU passport holders, and of course they can also be non-EU people. Can you use EU pilots on internal legs? Can we hire EU resident pilots? Not a problem with full importation, not at all. With temporary admission, it is also possible. It's just a precondition that the EU resident pilots are directly employed by the customs declarant. So it's not really a problem. You can solve that by way of a contract. So to conclude, full importation, the pros, full importation will give you all the necessary flight privileges for the typical Part 91 operator. The cons, full importation can have a huge economic effect, huge liability. Just look at the Isle of Man, like I mentioned. Temporary admission, the pros, it'll give you more or less the same flight privileges for the typical Part 91 or 135 operator, unless the aircraft is based within the EU. Any cons? Not really. They don't really affect the typical Part 91 or 135 operator. All of this is available on our website, the short stories, as we call them. It's also available up here, at least. I don't know if the back rows had any, but at least they're up here. It gives you quite a good, thorough presentation of everything. Please have a look. And of course, we are available. And now I have 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds to go. I made it.
Which gives you no time for questions. I think the key thing to know about EU VAT is it's when you had the Schleswig-Holstein, when Lord Palmerston once said it's so complicated only 3 people have ever understood it. One's dead, one's mad, and I've forgotten it. And I think that applies to VAT. One question I would like to put to you, though, or it's a comment. You're being a bit harsh on the Isle of Man. The EU has simply asked for more information.
Correct.
Okay. How will Brexit impact the UK overseas territories?
Well, just getting back to that other stuff, of course, you have to understand that there has to be an investigation. They have to ask questions first. That's how you initiate a case, right? So now they'll come up with an answer, and then the case will be proceeding.
Yeah, although if we've left, it's irrelevant if we've left the EU. And how will Brexit impact the UK overseas territories?
Say that again?
How will it impact overseas territories like Bermuda or Cayman?
I have no idea. You tell me.
I don't think they've ever been in the EU, so I think it's fine.
Yeah, they're outside.
Any more questions?